Well, it turns out that a lot of the work that I and others have been done and been done in recent years actually recaptures a tradition that an older tradition that had been forgotten. Uh, the effort is to explain how it is that human being, any normal human being, can, on the basis of limited and scattered data, acquire a quite remarkable capacity which is otherwise unknown in the biological world, the capacity that you and I are now using right now to create an unbounded array of expressions which capture thoughts, in fact, constitute thoughts, and to convey to others who have no access to our minds the internal workings of our thinking and planning and so on. That capacity, which was recognized centuries ago, can now be studied in ways that were not possible before, thanks to the development of the theory of computation by great mathematicians of the 20th century. We now understand well how a finite object like the brain can in fact construct an infinite array of structured expressions, each of which constitutes a thought, and we can externalize it in some sensory motor medium which will allow others to penetrate the work, to comprehend the workings of our minds. This is a species characteristic of humans. Every human group has this capacity. There are no group differences known. No other organism has anything even closely analogous. There's by now good reason to believe that this capacity developed fairly recently in evolutionary time, pretty much along with the appearance of modern Homo sapiens, and it is their distinctive characteristic and the source of their creativity and achievement. And within the last several decades, an enormous amount has been learned about this, far beyond anything that had even been contemplated earlier. These are, I think, major achievements of modern science and thought, to which many quite remarkable people have contributed. The kinds of questions that students are asking now, you couldn't even have formulated, let alone imagined not many years ago. And it's expanding and flourishing. So it's been a very exciting period from this point of view. Well, in the first part of the 20th century, the dominant themes were structuralist and behavioralist. The language was regarded not as a trait of human beings, but as some external object. So, for example, for Ferdinand de Saussure, the founder of structural linguistics, language is a collection of word images in the minds of a community, not an individual. For Leonard Bloomfield, leading the most prominent American linguist of the early 20th century, language is the set of utterances that can be expressed in a speech community. So it's something kind of out there, not in here. For maybe the leading, one of the most important philosophers of language, W.V. Quine, language is I'm quoting him, a fabric of sentences associated with one another and with stimuli. But again, something not a trait of an individual human being. Now that's quite different from the tradition. The last serious representative of a long tradition was Otto Jespersen, great linguist, about a century ago, identified the task of linguistics as trying to discover what he called a concept of structure in the mind of the person, which enables that person to construct new expressions, free expressions, which constitute the thoughts in their minds. But that notion, which had been developed, couldn't really be pursued because there was no clear way to understand the notion, concept of structure in the mind. Now we can do that. The linguistics of the latter part of the 20th century on till today has regarded, at least the major strain of it, has regarded language as a property of an individual, a structure in an organization of in the brain which has the capacity to create and construct expressions of thought without limit in accordance with circumstances and relevant to experience. That's a sharp change from the structuralist behaviorist tradition. If you look back at structural behavioral linguistics, it was very narrow in scope. It dealt mostly with phonology, sound structure, a little bit of morphological structure, and never raised the kinds of questions that I've just mentioned, which had been part of the tradition. A large part of linguistics was essentially procedures of analysis. How do you take a corpus of material from some informant, apply various procedures to it, present it in organized form, then it's over. But not asking what are the fundamental principles that enter into this that are part of the basic faculty of language, hence uniform across languages, that allow this immense leap from scattered data to the capacity to create, produce thoughts without limit appropriate to circumstances. That question was not raised. It is essentially a question of biology, and in fact much of recent work is called biolinguistics. So the substantial change is moving from a concept of language as something external to people, which somehow they connect to an individual trait of people shared among the species, because it is a species property, which furthermore provides the means for this creative capacity, provides what great linguist Wilhelm von Humboldt back in the early 19th century called a method for infinite use of finite means. In the tradition, that was just a slogan, but now we can fill out the details in many fundamental respects. Well, like a lot of things in life, is kind of accidental. One significant stimulus was, in fact, the development in by the mid-20th century of the general theory of computability. Great mathematicians like Kurt Gödel, Alan Turing, Emil Post, others had made it had clarified precisely what it means for a finite object to have infinite generative capacity. That's became well understood. And with those concepts in mind, it is possible to return to the problems that animated the tradition, but that they could not correctly address. I should say that all of this happened in almost total ignorance of the history of the subject, which had been completely forgotten. So even great linguists like Jespersen, the last representative of the tradition, was almost unknown to structural linguistics by mid-20th century. There's some historical research on this. The entire tradition was unknown, but it was reconstructed and rediscovered, and now with means to address traditional problems that did not exist before. In fact, as soon as you begin to look at the most elementary properties of language, you see that there are very puzzling things which had never been noticed because of the restrictions and limits of the structuralist behavioral approach to these topics, which, while it made many contributions, and indeed a great deal was learned, it was very narrow in scope. The small number of the kinds of questions that could be addressed were very limited, not the kind that I've just been talking about. Well, just paying attention to the facts. I mean, it is a remarkable fact that a young child, say a 2 or 3-year-old child, has mastered a rich understanding of properties of language, for which the child has had no evidence whatsoever. As soon as you look at that problem, you immediately recognize that there must be something internal to the individual that directs the course of development and growth of this incredible competence, and shapes it, and it is common to all human beings. So it becomes kind of like the question of why do we have the particular kind of visual system we have, say a mammalian visual system, not an insect visual system. It's not because of the nutrition to the cell, it's because of our genetic predisposition to grow and develop in particular ways. As soon as you face that overwhelming fact, the next thing you look at is, well, what are these built-in principles? And the efforts of the past years have been to try to refine, sharpen, determine the nature of principles which will account for this ability. At the same time, the problems and devices developed in generative grammar led to an enormous explosion of empirical research at a level of depth and insight that had never been dreamt of before. So by now we have enormous amounts of evidence about typologically different languages over a very wide range, which serves as, again, as a stimulus, an exciting stimulus to try to determine and discover what are the uniformities that underlie them. On the surface, they look very different, but when you begin to investigate the principles that generate the structures and interpretations of expressions, you find striking uniformities that had never been even thought of before. All of these are stimuli, results, interacting, which have led to the flourishing of the field. Also, I should say that related disciplines have also been developing in kind of cross-fertilization, deriving from these results and contributing to them. Like, for example, the study of language acquisition, which has progressed far beyond anything that was known before. The study of language processing, how does a person take the noises that appear and understand them as an expression of a semantically interpreted expression of thought. There's even by now beginning to be significant neurolinguistic research which is seeking to discover and to some extent is shedding light on the neural processes that are taking place during these achievements of use and the growth of language. So we have a number of different disciplines have developed which barely existed, say in mid-20th century, which are contributing to one another and reaching a level where new problems on the horizon are being formulated, being addressed. New technology has helped to an extent. So I'd say many different factors have entered into the developments that have taken place. Well, for one thing, we can anticipate in advance that that's going to be the case simply by observing the fact that a child does develop rich and complex knowledge of language on the basis of scattered and impoverished data. And any child, we know, is capable of doing this for any language. So there just have to be fundamental, deep, uniform principles that overcome the gap between data presented and knowledge attained. Then why do we, the next question, of course, is to discover what these principles are. And more we have found that languages that look on the surface very different turn out to be fundamentally the same in their basic major properties. So there are, for example, some languages 30 or 40 years ago, it was assumed by the most advanced linguists in the field, very fine linguists in generative grammar, that there are languages which have simply what's called flat structure. The word order is virtually free, no hierarchical structure of the kind that you find in English. Some indigenous languages were believed to have this property. In fact, even Japanese and German were thought at some time to have basically this property. Further research demonstrated that, in fact, when you look carefully at the ways in which sentences are interpreted and constructed, you find the very same hierarchical structures hidden behind the surface appearance of free word order and flat structure. And things like this have been discovered over and over, and that fills in the understanding of how this leap from data to intricate and precise knowledge does take place. Very similar to the study of how other capacities develop. Take again, say, the visual system. We know it can vary. We know from experimental evidence that it can vary tremendously depending on experience, but nevertheless it develops in a particular fixed way because of a genetic endowment that determines that this is what a human visual system is. The task of the sciences is to take that phenomenal observation and to discover how all of this can take place. And it's pretty much the same in the study of language. We find very much the same kinds of things. In fact, it's kind of interesting that if you look back, say, to the 1950s, it was assumed, quoting from one of the most prominent theoretical linguists, that languages can differ from one another in arbitrary ways, and each one has to be studied on its own without preconceptions. That was sometimes called the Boasian principle, after great anthropological linguist Franz Boas. The same kind of thing was believed about organisms, that they can vary arbitrarily and almost arbitrarily in infinite number of ways, and each has to be studied on its own. By now it's well known in contemporary biology that it's simply not true, that there's very limited and constrained forms of possible organisms, body body plans are pretty much the same. They were all pretty much set around the Cambrian explosion 500,000 years ago. There's deep conservation of properties, and very similar discoveries have been made about language. What looks on the surface, when you don't understand the system, it looks kind of random and chaotic. The more you become to understand its internal workings, you see principles that are uniform, fixed, deep, do not reveal themselves directly in the surface phenomena. One great Nobel laureate in physics once said that the goal of science is to discover the hidden invisibles that lie behind the surface visibles. That captures very well the course of scientific inquiry aimed at explanation of how surface phenomena have the properties they have. And we're finding that over and over in the case of study of language in the last 50 or 60 years, increasingly today. By now there are significant ideas about very simple combinatorial processes that can provide surprising explanations for deep uniformities of language found everywhere with surprising properties. Well, it's a very striking fact that the properties of language are not found, the essential properties of language have no serious analogs elsewhere in the biological world. So just take the simple fact that each language has the property of what's called discrete infinity. So for example, there's a 5-word sentence, there's a 6-word sentence, there's no 5.5-word sentence, and it goes on forever. That simple property is extremely rare in the biological world. Furthermore, a language has hierarchical structures which are the basis for the operations that apply to form new expressions that are over an infinite range. Again, there's nothing comparable to that, even remotely analogous elsewhere in the biological world. In fact, even when you look at the nature of the elementary concepts of language, words like tree, house, river, and so on, you find that they have properties not known in other edible symbolic systems. So the mode of acquisition, the manner of use, the internal structural properties, all of this seems to be quite unique to humans and has long been recognized to be at the core of our distinctive, creative accomplishments. Again, for pretty obviously not mimicked anywhere in the animal world. Well, there are theories that claim, I wouldn't call them theories, there are claims that language is a cultural product. But the problem with those claims is there's no way to spell them out in a way which explains any of the facts that we've been discussing. So I don't see any alternative to the conclusion that it's a product of biological evolution, which which apparently took place roughly at the time that modern humans developed, so it appears, and has distinctive properties shared by all cultural groups. It doesn't change the fact that languages, of course, do vary, and they are embedded in rich cultural systems, which you can study on their own. But the fundamental basic structure of language, the properties that enable an infant to gain the capacities that, say, you and I are now using. Those seem uniform to the species, independent of any culture. Well, it's in the society in the sense that each individual in the society shares not only a general language capacity, which all humans share, but share a particular implementation of that capacity, not identically. You take any two human beings, you and me, we'll look at our language closely, we'll find small differences between them, but enough shared capacity so that we can interact freely, and therefore language becomes the major means of social interaction within roughly shared individuals. That's a society. Well, the study of language is uniquely positioned as a science which is just part of the humanities. I mean, the humanities include literature, the arts, all of which interact very closely with language as their medium and mode of interaction. So you can't really place the study of language in one or another domain. It straddles all of them.